Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another installment of my video blog, which is being sponsored today by the Independent Canadian Commission on Civil and Human Rights. It's a new not-for-profit organization that is focused on media advocacy, spreading important social awareness and research, and it was developed in the absence of a corresponding federal organization to defend and support and advocate for the affirmation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. In our discussion today, or my presentation rather, I'm going to be talking about the what in my view appears to be the scam that Bill-96 represents as an instrument to allegedly support and protect the French language. If you support the representation I have to make today, I invite you to click the link below and support our leave to appeal in the Supreme Court in our efforts to defend a fair and just society for all Canadians as it pertains to their interaction with the Quebec legal system, which is not recognizing vital rights which have been affirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada before and have been affirmed in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, in terms of Bill 96, as Canadians in general and Quebecers specifically, as Canadians, we have been, socialized, so to speak, or it has been impressed upon that the reason that the Quebec government needs Bill 96 is that the French language is declining due to Anglophones moving into the province, not learning French, and without this coercive mechanism to so-called protect the French language would be continuing to be decline in Quebec specifically relative to Canada. And this whole construct of a coercive mechanism as a needed instrument to protect the French language in Quebec is ridiculous, is nonsense. We can see in the United States, for example, we see the Spanish language flourishing in the United States, and apparently I saw statistics that there are 6 million non-Spanish speaking people, 6 million students of Spanish enthusiastically seeking to learn Spanish, who are not being coerced, and that the Spanish language is thriving, particularly in reference to Florida, and there's no sort of coercive, language laws to support that flourishing of the Spanish language. So what I'm going to do today is specifically express what, in my view, is the reasons why the French language has been reportedly, according to Statistics Canada, being in decline. The reasons for that, outside of the scam rhetoric that is that tries to convince us that coercion is needed to protect the French language, and I relay my experiences as someone who has had interaction with the Quebec legal system. I relay my experiences as someone who has coordinated an initiative, a bilingual book fair called Salon de Livre d'Ottawa, Ottawa International Book Expo, specifically on an Ottawa International Craft and Book Expo as the formal name, dedicated in part to support a bilingual environment and to support writers, authors, independent authors in French. The three reasons which I want to discuss today that pertain to the decline of the French language. The first reason is A, the authoritarian nature of the way in which the French language is being maintained in Quebec as one reason. Second reason is a culture of coercion, in fact, which is resulting in problems and stagnation regarding the growth of the French language. And three, the other aspect which I wanted to also touch on is a perception of social exclusion, which is which is not supporting the growth of the French language among non-francophone speakers. It's not making it attractive as it could be without that coercive mechanism. Now, as someone who has been working around with independent francophone writers, and as someone who has understood the importance of literature writing in promoting the vibrancy, the vitality of a language, the independent writers, particularly as it pertains to Quebec, independent francophone writers ought to be the backbone of this, driving a flourishing environment for the French language. But what we have in Quebec is a context whereby the very people, the very writers, the very independent culture of writers, which one would think should be supported, are in fact being repressed in Quebec. Specifically, many of us as English-speaking people are aware that the book self-publishing revolution that has taken place, so to speak, led by institutions like Amazon, in English-speaking world, writers you see all the time, writers of English in the English language who are finding the opportunities in being able to express themselves, their identities, their experiences through book self-publishing. And that has driven a lot of the Amazon, and has been an important revolution, so to speak, in the English-speaking world. Well, this type of environment has not been able to reach Quebec, because what happens in Quebec, and again, I'm going to the first region, which is an environment of the authoritarian nature of the Quebec environment, which is undercutting the very people that ought to be supported in promoting the French language. What happens is that if you are a self-published writer in Quebec, an author, and you have a book, you cannot get your book in bookstores like Renaud Bray. You cannot get your book in various francophone booksellers because you are not a member of the clique of francophone Quebec francophone corporate publishers, which have been approved with the agreement of the Quebec government and a pool of francophone Quebec publishers. They have a cartel. They have a hold on which books get published and which books get sold at bookstores across Quebec, excluding namely Indigo, which is primarily English. So what this does is that if you are a francophone writer, you have a much better chance of being able to express yourself and express your identity and who you are by switching to English and self-publishing yourself in English and being able to get on Amazon, be able to get on various English booksellers. And so what is happening in Quebec is that, and I've seen this as someone who was working with francophone writers, I'm seeing more and more francophone writers, francophones who are working in English, writing in English because of this information cartel between the francophone Quebec published. There was originally the Salon system in Quebec, which is a collection of different a consortium of salons in Quebec, which were designed to you know, controlled Quebec culture because the Quebec government was concerned about the France taking over sort of in a neo-colonial way and controlling the expression of Quebec culture. So as they created this salon system, they created a salon system to protect Quebec culture or identity from being submerged by the control by France and its corporate publishers. But at the same time, what it did, what this sort of environment did, was that it also repressed the ability of francophone independent writers and authors to express themselves, because now they can't, if they publish a book, they're going to have to try to flog it online themselves and have their own website, because they are not going to have the access to these booksellers in Quebec, as well as these salons or these Quebec book fairs, which are all corporate and government-controlled book fairs. So when you have this type of environment from the standpoint of francophones, it makes speaking English and going and speaking English and writing in English a lot more attractive, because you are not going to get the same type of respect, support, and access to the market if you're speaking in and trying to make ends meet, and as a francophone author. If you're an anglophone author, you'll be able to get the access. If you turn as an anglophone, if you're a francophone and start to take and become, start to write your books in English to the French, you had to have the advantage of being able to have a wide choice of what book fairs you go to, have a wide choice of where to sell your books and stuff like that, and the media and lots of bloggers, lots of media people will be interested in you. Not so in Quebec. In Quebec, you not only have you will not only not be able to freely sell your books in various francophone booksellers in the province. You won't be able to, you'll be excluded substantively from much of this, these Quebec book fairs, which are controlled by the Salon Consortium. You won't be able to get on there because, first of all, they're extremely expensive, and they only allow very, very few independent francophone writers in these book fairs. That's the third part of the exclusion is these organizations, these broadcasters like TVA, like Radio Canada. I have direct experience with these institutions. They will fence you off. They are not accommodating to, from my experience, to francophone independent writers. They have an ear for the corporate Quebecois publishers, but when it comes to the francophone independent writers, you are on the bottom heap when it comes to Radio Canada and all these much of the corporate control media outlets in Quebec. So this is what is this exclusionary context has created this sort of authoritarian control. What we have in Quebec is and we can see the results of that in Quebec. The result of this is that when you look at go to a Quebec bookstore, when you listen to the Quebec media, the purpose of this is only to allow certain voices to talk about what the Quebec identity is, to have a discourse of what literature is, or what the culture is. The whole intent of this corporate control and government control, authoritarian direction of Quebec culture is to exclude and to marginalize voices that are not a part of that corporate government clique. So this type of environment to francophones who want to express themselves, who are opposed to certain elements of Quebec society, so to speak, they are being fenced off, and English is becoming more and more attractive to them, whether they're authors or whether it's moving to Toronto and or other parts of Canada or to the States or elsewhere. There is, the same type of clique mentality permeates Quebec society um, at all levels, and creates a cliquey environment, which ends up not being working against the support and affirmation and growth and flourishing of the French language in Quebec. The solution to that is that we need to make, as far as the French language, create an environment where the people who are the backbones of driving the growth of the French language, we need to create an environment whereby we stop this cartel of control by these Quebec government and the Quebec corporations in terms of who gets access to Quebec booksellers, who gets access to the media. We need Quebec. There needs to be a stop to that, and there needs to be a corresponding environment in Quebec whereby people who are francophones, who want to self-publish, who want to write about Quebec in any way they want to, they should be allowed free access to francophone booksellers. They should be the institutions, particularly like Radio Canada, which is supposed to be a public broadcaster, should make itself more accessible to francophones who are not members of the in-clique group, which is a part of this authoritarian construct of Quebec. There needs to be an environment for the flourishing of Quebecan culture and in terms of the francophone identity, in a way which encourages francophones to want to be able to continue to support the communication and expression of identity for those francophones who are not a part of the corporate clique. Instead, we have an environment which people are not talking about, which is creating an incentive for francophones to become more anglicized and to become even completely anglicized, because the environment in Quebec is stifling to not only their ability to express themselves as writers, but their ability to participate in various parts of the economic community and economic development of Quebec. So that's the first issue, the Quebec clique, which is creating a unattractive environment for many francophones who are moving away or are turning to English or feel stifled in an environment which is being controlled by a authoritarian clique of Quebec corporations, including broadcasters like Radio Canada and TVA, and and the Quebec government managing the Quebec's culture. And this is why when you go online to a Quebec bookseller, you won't find any, you won't find too many books talking about criticizing the Legault government, criticizing government policy, criticizing corporate policy, because they've completely. Yet there are many Quebecers which have something critical to say about government policy and corporate, and corporations and various aspects of Quebec, but they are not being allowed to express themselves and stuff. But the Quebec government and the corporations who want to create an illusion that there is some sort of unanimity of Quebec, and that whatever the Premier Legault says, he speaks for everybody in Quebec when he doesn't speak for everybody in Quebec. So what they're basically doing is using this control to create an illusion that people buy into, and much not too far off in terms ideologically or philosophically to what we see in various authoritarian societies, which merge government and corporate power for the purposes of propaganda, control, in a way which stifles cultural development. So the second issue, apart from that, the second issue I want to touch on is the coercive laws. In my view, creating coercion as a mechanism is not a positive way to attract people to a culture and an identity. It creates an environment of resistance. People get ups, people feel that they're being marginalized by a group trying to dominate them and control them, and in a way which is inconsistent with their rights. And this type of coercion going on right now has created a license for the complete abrogation of human and civil rights, which is the substance of my leave to appeal to the Supreme Court, an environment where people who are Anglophones and do not, or on other minority languages who don't speak French, are being repressed and being marginalized in the Quebec's legal system, which doesn't want to accept their rights as guaranteed by the Supreme Court of Canada and the Charter of Rights and Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, their inviolable rights to a court interpreter. So Bill-96 has created this environment of exclusion, of marginalization, of resistance, rather than creating a positive environment where people are attracted to the language because of it inspires them, it drives them, it creates an environment that's part of an environment of new opportunities opening for them. That's what we need to create in Quebec to turn, to and the rest of Canada, but in particular in Quebec, to strengthen the Quebec language, not through coercion, but through a positive mechanism where people see that the culture of French is attractive to them and that it is creating opportunities for them that they would not get outside of an environment where they're being coerced and they're being marginalized. So that's the second reason. So the first reason again is the environment which is authoritarian-driven environment, which is chasing away and undermining the use of French by francophones themselves, whose opportunities are being limited by the current cultural context of repression. Second reason is coercion is not a positive way to support the affirmation of a cultural identity. The third way is from my direct interaction with the Quebec legal system, and that has to do with social exclusion. Now, if you want to understand what is going on in Quebec in terms of why the Bill-96 is such hypocrisy and what is really going on, you need not go any further than to examine the Quebec Human Rights Commission and examine the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal. Now, these two organizations are supposed to supposedly be the crucible, the symbol of Quebec's commitment to the affirmation of human rights and stuff. And again, I want to go back to my previous video that the overwhelming majority of people, francophones who are Quebec, support values of justice and fairness for everybody. My particular critique deals with an elite group in Quebec, an elite group that works between the government and the corporate elites, both of them together, and government, and particularly as it pertains to the bureaucracy, as it pertains to the judiciary, and as it pertains to the reinforcement of repression by the various police services in Quebec. Now, going back to the Quebec Human Rights Commission and the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, which is the court dealing with dealing with human rights in Quebec. One very shocking thing there is that that it's very notable in these organizations that if you look at their hierarchies, if you look at who is actually making the adjudications in Quebec in terms of judges, look at who is actually the decision makers in the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, look at who's investigating, who is controlling the direction of the Quebec Human Rights Commission. One notable thing one thing which I saw, which I was quite shocked by, is that you won't find significant minority and language minority populations in these institutions. In the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, I found no, and the Quebec Human Rights Commission specifically, no Anglophones who are fluent in French but are originally Anglophones. A lack of minorities. You don't find, in terms of South Asian people of, Asian, First Nations, all these people that are that supposedly the Quebec Human Rights Commission and the tribunal has educative authority over, are completely excluded from these institutions. The Quebec Human Rights Commission there was a lady of African ancestry who was there. They squeezed her out, replaced her with a white francophone male, and that is the culture of both the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal and the Quebec Human Rights Commission. It is certain cliques of white francophones running both these organizations. And the minority, the Anglophone minority, who's the largest language minority in Quebec, and the visible minority populations are First Nations group are, from my observation, are been completely excluded. So, and these two institutions are supposed to be the symbol of the Quebec's commitment to its own Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It talks about the commitment of equality and justice, and you can't discriminate. Yet we find a lack of this. We find that a lack of this commitment in terms of who it is deciding to adjudicate. In terms of adjudicative authority, in terms of who's controlling, in terms of the management, in terms of the decision makers, in terms of who are the lawyers who are going to be assisting with cases in the Quebec Human Rights Commission. All these groups are excluded, as if they're not South Asian, First Nations, Black people, all brown, yellow, pink, green people, graduating from law schools who speak French, who are able to be qualified as, human rights representatives, judges, as if there are no choice available. So that goes to my third point with respect to the hypocrisy of Bill-96, is that a substantive challenge to the vitality of the French language has to do with the perception, in my view, that a subtext of racism, of discrimination dominating Quebec, which creates an environment which is not palatable to people who would otherwise want to learn French. Whereas in the English environment is immediately is accepting of diversity, of of whether you're Hindu, whether you're Muslim, whether you're white, yellow, black, or green, whatever is your language. In the English culture of Canada, there is a drive for social acceptance, even though the English culture in Canada has its own racism. There is an effort to accommodate, and this is why francophones are being accommodated outside of Quebec. This is why they're being accommodated, and there's a respect for the rights of francophones to have a free court interpreter, because that is the nature of the English-speaking culture in Canada, which is attractive not only to these immigrants, which turn to English, but to the francophones themselves. And if you go to, for example, the Human Rights Commission in Ontario, if you go to other these educated panels, you'll see visible minorities in dominant positions, which you will not find at the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal and the Quebec Human Rights Commission. And those two organizations, the type of exclusion against Anglophones of all races and people of all visible minority and First Nations, those two institutions, the Quebec Human Rights Commission and the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, when you look at who isn't controlling them, when you look at the exclusion that is in terms of who they're hiring, that sums up basically the hypocrisy of Bill-96. So you have an environment where you say you need to coerce people to learn French, but at the same time you are excluding people from basic economic opportunities, and that even includes your own Human Rights Commission and your own Human Rights Tribunal. That is not making the French language attractive. When you create an environment where francophones themselves are, who are not a part of the corporate clique, are being excluded from participating in your own public broadcaster, Radio Canada, from when they're being excluded from being able to sell books at your bookstores, when they're being excluded from being able to participate at book fairs, which are being controlled by these corporate clique, because they don't want francophones who to start talking about Quebec in ways which they don't control and stuff like that, making them that is not supporting the vitality of the French language in Quebec. So this whole idea that the Bill-96 is needed this whole is ridiculous. Bill-96 is a step further towards an authoritarian direction, and that's exactly the wrong direction that we need to take in order to support the vitality of the French language. I invite people who are interested in learning about our initiative, the Independent Canadian Commission on Human and Civil Rights, to check out the website humanrightscommission.ca, humanrightscommission.ca. It's a grassroots, not-for-profit initiative. We invite anybody which supports anything which I have to say to either make your comments below or to click the link below and support our efforts in the Supreme Court of Canada to affirm fairness for everybody when it comes to access to justice, which is being denied in Quebec to non-francophones. And we invite anybody who shares the concerns about Bill-96 as simply a scam designed to subvert our basic rights. If anybody who supports the idea that Bill-96 is subversive to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the efforts of any Canadians to have any interactions with the Quebec legal system to defend their right, if you share these concerns, if you're from abroad or anywhere internationally, which shares the importance and of fairness for everybody, then, across the globe, we invite you to make your comments and any donation support you might want to have by clicking the link below. Thanks for your listening today to our broadcast titled informally, the hypocrisy of Bill-96 and its denial of access to justice and the real reasons for the undermining of the French language, which does not, again, have to do with simply Anglophones not wanting to learn language and just moving in and upsetting the balance of the French language and requiring everybody to be coerced. We oppose that premise, and we invite your comments and support accordingly. Thank you very much for, again, taking the time to listen to this commentary, so to speak, and we invite you to listen to other comments that we might have to share of a human rights and civil rights nature. Thanks again.